In the autumn of 1930, Britain was preparing to celebrate a technological miracle. The R101, the largest British airship ever constructed, was ready to embark on a journey to India that would cement the nation's dominance over the skies. The voyage had been planned for months, the passengers selected, the route mapped, the future seemed certain. But in the hours before departure, no one could have known that this airship would make history in tragedy, and that the seeds of its destruction had been sown years earlier, hidden beneath layers of ambition, politics, and a dangerous refusal to acknowledge warning signs that had been there all along. To understand what happened on that fateful night of October 4th, we must first understand what the R101 represented to Britain. In the 1920s and early 1930s, the aviation industry was entering a new era. The age of rigid airships, massive structures filled with hydrogen and controlled by teams of engineers and pilots, captured the imagination of the world. These weren't the small blimps we know today. They were floating cities, capable of traveling thousands of miles with passengers in comfort that even luxury ocean liners could not match. Germany had mastered airship design with their fleet of Zeppelins, and they dominated the market. Britain, unwilling to concede this technological frontier to a rival nation, made a bold decision. They would build not just one, but two massive airships to prove their engineering prowess. The first was the R100, constructed by a private company called Vickers. The second was the R101, built by the Royal Airship Works, a government facility in Cardington, Bedfordshire. And this rivalry between the two projects would set the stage for tragedy. Because the competition wasn't driven by science, it was driven by politics, by pride, and by the desperate need to prove that one method was superior to the other. But which one would emerge victorious? The R101 was born from a dream but constructed amid compromises. Designed under immense pressure and an impossible deadline, the airship was over 700 feet long, as tall as a 20-story building, and filled with over 5 million cubic feet of hydrogen. Passengers would travel in luxury, dining saloon, sleeping cabins, even a smoking room, all suspended beneath the massive balloon envelope. On paper, it was the pinnacle of British achievement. In reality, it had been rushed into service despite mounting evidence that something was fundamentally wrong. For a complex machine requiring precision and careful testing, it meant shortcuts that would prove catastrophic. The first warning sign came early. During initial tests, the R101 was tested to see if it made its target weight of 90 tons. Engineers were astonished to discover that it actually weighed in at 113.4 tons, 23.4 tons heavier than calculated. It was enough to give even the most bullish proponent pause. The excess weight meant the ship could not lift its intended passenger load while maintaining proper balance. Engineers decided on a drastic measure to solve this. The ship would be lengthened by 46 feet, adding an extra bay and gas bag in the midsection to increase its hydrogen capacity. This reconstruction provided roughly 11% more lift, enough to restore her operating margin, but it also added complexity and altered the airship's stress patterns. Every major modification introduced new uncertainties that could only be resolved through extensive flight testing, yet political and scheduling pressure left little time for that. R101 emerged from the rebuild larger and more capable on paper, but with her safety margin eroded before she ever left the mast. The second warning arrived during high-speed and altitude trials, when inspectors revealed that the ship's outer cover had become dangerously degraded. Chief Inspector McWade found pre-doped sections where a rubber solution had reacted with the dope, leaving fabric friable like scorched brown paper, so that if you crumpled it in your hand it broke up. Rather than replace the ruined panels, the team applied reinforcing strips and patches, redoping in place. That emergency repair work increased the airship's bulk and degraded its weatherworthiness. If the outer cover failed, it could chafe bags, admit water, and make leak and trim problems worse, reducing useful lift and demanding more ballast or fuel. Assistant Chief Designer Michael Rope did not mince words. In a memo to his superiors, he wrote that the rotted cover meant that there is no margin of safety for flight in a rough atmosphere. Any overseas flight, he recommended, should be postponed for 6 months. His warning was ignored. Despite these clear cautions, the flight schedule held, leaving R101 heavier, patched, and vulnerable. The third warning came in the final days before departure. At Cardington, Chief Designer Lieutenant Colonel Vincent Richmond and his team met with Lord Thompson, the Air Minister who had championed the Imperial airship scheme and intended to join the maiden voyage himself. Thompson was no engineer, but he was deeply invested, politically and personally, in seeing the flight succeed. The design team voiced their concerns. The ship had never flown at full operational weight, the weather over northern France looked uncertain, and the recent structural and fabric modifications had not been tested under long-range conditions. They advised caution, perhaps postponement. These were not wild fears or baseless anxieties. They were professional assessments from the men who had designed the machine. Criticism was not confined to those within the project. Naval architect Edward F. Spanner explained how he had a very poor opinion of Goldbeater's skin-lined fabric as a container for passengers' lives. Yet the schedule was fixed, the publicity arranged, and the political stakes immense. The Court of Inquiry later observed that the flight would likely never have started had it not been that matters of public policy made it highly desirable. The R101 would depart as planned, with Lord Thompson aboard, travelling to India despite the unresolved issues. What would happen when a machine built on compromises and half measures finally met the harsh realities of weather, weight, and physics? October 3rd, 1930, dawned grey over Bedfordshire. The R101 was being prepared for departure. The weather reports were unfavourable. A cold front bringing rain, wind, and pressure changes was moving across northern France. Meteorologists recommended waiting, but the timeline would not permit delay. Lord Thompson had commitments. The publicity was arranged. Departure was set for Saturday evening. The crew made final checks, filled fuel tanks, verified the gas cells. What no one understood was that they were about to push a machine beyond its design tolerances in weather conditions that would expose every weakness. By the evening of the Saturday, the weather had worsened. At 6:36 p.m., the R101 chapter cast off for the last time. The airship rose slowly into the darkening sky, struggling against the wind. 5 diesel engines roared as the enormous vessel climbed. Lord Thompson was aboard, celebrating what he believed would be his triumphant journey to India. The crew was at their stations. By 7 p.m., the airship was cruising toward France and the Mediterranean, toward India and glory. But even at that early stage, witnesses on the ground sensed something was wrong. The wife of author Shane Leslie had a close encounter with the ship as it passed over her cottage near Hitchin. Everything was lit up by a ghastly red and green light. We rushed out, and there was the R101, aiming straight for the house. She was so low it didn't seem as if she could miss it. She cleared the trees of our drive and the house by the smallest margin. I never thought she would make it. Beneath the surface, unseen by passengers and largely unknown to crew, the airship was in distress. The rain soaking into the outer covering added weight. The wind battered the airship, forcing it to use fuel to maintain heading and altitude. The gas cells were expanding in the cold upper atmosphere, stressing the already weakened frame. The additional cells inserted into the middle section strained against their moorings as the ship pitched and rolled in turbulent air. The crew maintained their course. The captain had flown before. He knew how to handle her, but the R101 that night was not the airship tested in calm weather. It was an overweight, underpowered, structurally compromised machine being pushed beyond its limits. Could they manage through the night? Around 2 a.m. on October 4th, the R101 encountered its fatal failure. In turbulent rain over northern France, witnesses on the ground saw the airship flying unusually low. Investigators later concluded that a tear had opened in the forward portion of the outer cover, likely near one of the forward gas bags. The rent allowed gas to escape, causing a sudden loss of lift in the nose. The ship pitched downward, growing increasingly nose-heavy. Inside the control car, the crew released water ballast and increased engine power in a desperate attempt to raise the bow. For a brief moment, the maneuver seemed to work. The nose lifted, the ship steadied, but the loss of gas had already doomed her. Within minutes, the airship was descending again, uncontrollable and fatally heavy in the nose, the crew unaware how extensive the damage truly was. The rip in the forward cover had probably ruptured one or more of the hydrogen gas bags beneath it, letting the gas escape into the airship's nose and out through the rent. The result was a rapid loss of lift in the forward compartments, making the ship increasingly nose-heavy. To the crew, it felt like a sudden sag, followed by partial recovery. Evidence, they thought, that their ballast adjustments had worked. In reality, the forward section was fatally compromised. With the gas already lost and the cover gaping open, aerodynamic forces and turbulence continued to drag the nose down. The ship could no longer maintain trim. What seemed like a momentary recovery was only a pause before the inevitable catastrophic descent. Around 2:05 a.m., the R101 descended through cloud. The airship was now lower than it had been all evening, several hundred feet lost since the envelope failure. The crew flew blind in darkness and rain, trying to maintain altitude with an airship no longer responding normally. The trim was wrong, the nose was too low, the engines couldn't provide enough lift. Then, through the cloud, the ground appeared, the forest near Beauvais in northern France, visible for only a moment. The captain and crew realized instantly what was about to happen. There was no time to climb, no way to gain altitude, no possibility of recovery. At 2:09 a.m., the R101 crashed. The impact was catastrophic. The airship tore apart as it collided with the forest floor. The massive framework crumpled. The envelope sections caught fire, not from collision, but from hydrogen igniting as it mixed with oxygen, creating an enormous explosion that lit up the French countryside. A storekeeper in a nearby village said, "There was a mighty explosion, something that you cannot imagine. It was as if the whole world had exploded." The gas giant had met its end in a gruesomely spectacular cataclysm. The R101 disaster sent shockwaves through Britain and the world. In total, 48 people perished, including Lord Thompson, the captain, the chief designer, and most of the senior crew. The recovery effort was arduous. Bodies were burned beyond recognition. The youngest to die was galley boy Thomas William Megginson, aged only 18. Only 6 survived. Inquiries were launched. Engineers pored over the wreckage. The cause was eventually established. The combination of envelope failure, weight problems, marginal buoyancy, and weather conditions had created a perfect storm of failure. From this tragedy emerged 5 critical lessons that would reshape aviation and engineering safety for generations. 1. Political pressure cannot override engineering reality. The R101 was built under constant pressure to meet political deadlines and prove superiority over private industry. The decision to bypass testing, rush modifications, and launch despite known technical problems was made by politicians, not engineers. While engineers expressed concerns, they deferred to political will. The post-disaster inquiries made clear the airship should never have flown. It was unfit for purpose, and this was knowable before departure. The lesson: there must be a clear separation between political pressure and technical decision-making. Safety cannot be negotiated in boardrooms. 2. The critical importance of proper testing. The R101 had never been flown at maximum operating weight or in severe weather conditions like those it encountered. Buoyancy and trim issues had been addressed with adjustments rather than fundamental redesign. Had the airship undergone extended trials under realistic conditions, the flaws would have become apparent. The lesson: cutting testing short to save time is a false economy that costs lives. Complex machines must be tested thoroughly under realistic conditions, and warning signs must trigger redesign, not merely adjustment. 3. The need to be aware of cascading compromises. The R101 wasn't doomed by a single flaw, but by a series of small compromises, each seeming acceptable in isolation, each pushing the airship further from required safety margins. Weight problems addressed by adding gas cells, addressed by adding protective coating weight, accepted because removing weight elsewhere seemed politically unacceptable. Each decision seemed reasonable in context, but together they created an aircraft marginally safe in ideal conditions and catastrophically unsafe in adversity. The lesson: engineering systems require robust safety margins built in from the beginning. When compromises erode those margins, the proper response is redesign or project cancellation. 4. Good communication within technical hierarchies. The engineers at the Royal Airship Works knew the R101 wasn't ready. They knew the weather was unsuitable. They knew about the weight and structural concerns. But these concerns were not forcefully communicated to decision makers, partly because of hierarchical structure and partly because engineers had a vested interest in project success. The lesson: organizations must create structures, allowing engineers to voice safety concerns without fear of retribution. Dissent must be permitted and actively encouraged, and taken seriously by those in positions of power. 5. Effective collaboration is a necessity on big projects. The Vickers R100, built privately, actually worked. It had made successful long-distance flights without the compromises the R101 was defined by. Competition between the two should have resulted in knowledge exchange and best practices. Instead, Rivalry between government and private enterprise created secrecy rather than sharing, with problems hidden to avoid vindication of the competitor. The lesson: rigid hierarchies, institutional pride, and fear of failure prevent the cross-pollination of ideas that keeps engineering safe. Transparency and collaboration serve safety better than secrecy and rivalry. The R101 lies in the archives of history now, a monument to the dangers of ambition without wisdom. The wreckage was collected and studied. Surviving crew were honoured. Lord Thomson was buried in Beauvais, France, far from the India he never reached. But his death and the deaths of the 47 others were not in vain. The lessons of the R101 became the foundation for modern aviation safety protocols. The disaster proved that technology, no matter how advanced, cannot overcome the consequences of poor judgment, political pressure, and denial of reality. And so the great airship, heavier than air should allow, stronger than its materials should permit, but ultimately vulnerable to the mistakes of the humans who built it, remains a cautionary tale. A disaster foretold by those with knowledge to see it, whose warnings went unheeded until it was too late.